Get him off my tarmac. The order cracked through the hot afternoon air, sharp as the whine of jet engines idling at full power, but the old man didn't move, not an inch, not even when the exhaust wash tugged at his faded jacket and sent loose gravel skittering across the concrete in tiny bursts of sound that echoed under the vast open sky of the base, and that was the first thing that felt wrong, because most people flinched at that kind of force. Most people stepped back without being told, but this man just stood there like he had stood in worse places than this, like noise and pressure were things he had long ago learned to ignore, and Lieutenant Ryan Cole saw none of that, only a problem standing where it didn't belong, only a disruption to the precision he believed he controlled, so he stepped forward, boots striking hard against the tarmac, posture rigid with authority that still smelled new, still untested. And he waved 2 airmen closer with a sharp flick of his hand as if dismissing something. Beneath his notice, "You deaf, old man, this is a restricted flight line, move or we move you." The words came fast, practiced, edged with the kind of confidence that came from rank printed on paper instead of earned in silence, and around them a small ring of personnel began to form, technicians pausing mid-task, a crew chief lowering his headset just enough to watch, the hum of machinery still constant but attention shifting, curiosity building in that quiet way it always did when something didn't quite fit the rules everyone relied on, and still the old man didn't react, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his gaze not on Cole, not on the airmen approaching him, but somewhere beyond them, fixed on the distant line where heat shimmer blurred steel and sky into one, as if he was measuring something no one else could see, and that unsettled one person in the crowd, Staff Sergeant Lucas Grant, who had seen that look before, not here, not on clean concrete under controlled conditions, but in places where calm wasn't normal, where silence carried weight, and he shifted slightly, just enough to get a clearer view, just enough to feel that quiet pressure building in his chest that told him this wasn't what it looked like, but Cole had already decided, already committed, and when one of the airmen stepped forward to take the old man by the arm, something small slipped from the man's grip, a worn leather pouch hitting the ground with a dull, almost insignificant thud, but it didn't bounce, didn't scatter, it just lay there, heavy with time, and one of the younger guys nudged it with his boot. Half a smirk forming like this was already over, like this was just another interruption to clear, and that was when the old man finally moved, not fast, not dramatic, just a slight turn of his head, enough for his voice to carry through the engine noise without effort, low, steady, impossible to ignore, "Call Mercer now," and the words didn't sound like a request, didn't sound like a suggestion, they landed like something already decided, something already in motion, and for a brief second no one spoke, no one laughed, the air itself seeming to tighten as if the entire flight line had missed a step, and Grant felt it then, clear and undeniable, that shift, that warning, like the ground beneath a structure beginning to move before anyone else realized it, and he reached for his radio before he even knew he was doing it while Lieutenant Cole just stared, confusion flickering across his face, because in that moment, for reasons he couldn't explain, it felt less like he was giving orders and more like he had just been interrupted by something far beyond his command. The radio felt heavier in Staff Sergeant Grant's hand than it should have, the plastic casing warm from the sun but slick with a sudden tension he could not explain, and for a moment he hesitated, eyes locked on the old man who had already turned back toward the distant runway as if the conversation was finished, as if everything that needed to be said had already been set in motion, while behind him Lieutenant Cole let out a short, disbelieving breath, the kind that usually came before a laugh, but never quite made it there. Did he just give an order? Cole muttered, more to himself than anyone else, but no one answered, not even the airman who had stepped forward moments ago with casual confidence, now standing uncertain, their hands hovering awkwardly as if unsure whether to continue or step back, and that hesitation spread like a ripple through the small crowd, subtle but undeniable, because something in the air had shifted, something invisible but heavy, and Grant finally keyed the radio, his voice low, controlled, choosing each word with care. "Command, this is Grant on Flight Line Charlie. I need confirmation on a name." There was a pause on the other end. Static crackling softly, routine at first, but Grant did not look away from the old man as he spoke again, slower this time. "Name is Hale, Arthur Hale," and for half a second nothing happened, just the hum of engines and the distant whine of a taxiing aircraft, and then the static changed, sharpened, voices overlapping in the background as if someone had just stepped into a room that mattered. "Say again," came the reply, no longer casual, no longer routine, and Grant repeated it, each syllable clear, Arthur Hale, and this time the silence that followed was not empty, it was full, dense, like a held breath stretching across miles of concrete and steel, and Grant felt it settle into his chest, that same instinct tightening, telling him he had just crossed a line he did not understand, while Lieutenant Cole straightened slightly, irritation returning in place of uncertainty, his authority reasserting itself like a reflex. That is enough, Sergeant, we are not calling command. Because some civilian says a name, but even as he said it, his voice lacked the edge it had moments before, something underneath it wavering, because the response on the radio came back too fast, too sharp, cutting straight through the chain he thought he controlled. Stand by, the voice said, clipped and immediate, followed by the unmistakable sound of movement on the other end, chairs shifting, footsteps, a door opening somewhere far away. And Grant lowered the radio slightly, his eyes still fixed on Hale, who had not moved, not reacted, as if this was exactly how it was supposed to unfold, as if he had already seen this moment play out long before anyone else realized they were part of it, and around them the flight line continued its rhythm but felt different now, the roar of engines less dominant, the heat less oppressive, everything filtered through that growing tension that no one could quite name, and then the radio came alive again, louder this time, a different voice, older, controlled, carrying authority without needing to raise its volume. Who made the call? And Grant answered immediately, Staff Sergeant Grant, sir. There was another pause. Shorter now, precise, and then the words that changed everything, do not move him, I am on my way, and the line went dead, leaving only the fading echo of that command hanging in the air, and Grant exhaled slowly, not realizing he had been holding his breath, while Lieutenant Cole stared at him, confusion now fully visible, because whatever he had expected, it was not this, not the speed, not the tone, not the quiet certainty that something far above his level had just been activated, and as the distant thump of approaching rotor blades began to bleed into the background noise, low at first but growing steadily, every person on that flight line felt it, that shift from routine to something else entirely, something they were no longer in control of, and at the center of it all, Arthur Hale simply stood, waiting, as if he had never doubted what would come next. The sound reached them before the aircraft did, a low rhythmic thump that pressed against the air like a distant heartbeat growing stronger with every passing second, and conversations across the flight line began to die without anyone giving the order, technicians lowering tools, airmen straightening unconsciously as heads turned toward the horizon where a dark silhouette cut through the shimmering heat, descending fast, deliberate, controlled. And Lieutenant Cole felt it then, that subtle shift slipping further out of his grasp, the situation no longer something he could dismiss or command away, his jaw tightening as he tried to steady himself. It is just a flyby, he said under his breath, but even he did not believe it, not with the way every instinct in the people around him had sharpened at once, not with the way Staff Sergeant Grant had gone completely still, eyes tracking the incoming aircraft with a focus that spoke of recognition, not surprise, and at the center of it all Arthur Hale remained unchanged, standing exactly where he had been, hands loose, posture relaxed, as if the approaching thunder was nothing more than confirmation of something already decided. And when the helicopter finally broke through the heat haze, its rotor wash tearing across the tarmac in waves of dust and grit, it did not circle, did not hesitate. It came straight in, descending onto the edge of the flight line with precision that spoke of urgency without chaos, and the moment the landing skids touched concrete, the engines did not fully wind down, blades still cutting the air in a steady roar as the side door slid open and a figure stepped out, moving fast, purposeful, without a single glance at anyone else, and even before the rank insignia caught the light, everyone felt it, that presence that did not need introduction, Colonel David Mercer walking across the tarmac with long, unbroken strides, his focus locked ahead, not on the lieutenant, not on the gathered personnel, but on one man alone, and Lieutenant Cole instinctively straightened, preparing to report, to reassert control, but the words never came, because Mercer did not slow, did not acknowledge him, did not even turn his head as he passed within a few feet, the wind from the rotors snapping sharply at his uniform, and that was the moment it became undeniable. This was not a routine response. Not a chain of command being followed in the way Cole understood it, this was something else entirely, something older, something deeper, and the closer Mercer got, the quieter everything seemed to become, the noise of the helicopter fading into the background, the heat, the movement, the entire flight line narrowing down to the space between two men, until finally Mercer stopped just short of Arthur Hale, not directly in front of him, not in a position of authority, but slightly behind, off to his right, a placement so subtle most would miss it, but to those who understood, it said everything, and for a brief moment neither of them spoke, the air holding still between them, and then Mercer's posture shifted, not dramatically, just enough, his shoulders squaring, his stance tightening into something unmistakable, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low, controlled, carrying a weight that did not need to be raised. "Sir," he said, and the word landed heavier than any command issued that day, sending a ripple through every person watching, because nothing in their training prepared them for that, not the tone, not the direction of it, not the realization that the man they had dismissed, questioned, nearly escorted away, was being addressed with a respect that outranked everything they thought they understood, and Lieutenant Cole felt it hit him fully then, the ground beneath his certainty giving way, because whatever role he believed he held in this moment had just been replaced by something he could not define, something he could not control, and as Arthur Hale finally turned slightly, acknowledging Mercer with nothing more than a quiet glance, the entire weight of the situation settled into place, not explained, not announced, but understood in the only way that mattered, through silence. The word hung in the air longer than it should have, not loud, not forced, just a single syllable carrying more weight than anything Lieutenant Cole had said all afternoon, and for a moment no one moved because no one knew how to respond to it, not when a full colonel had just addressed a man in a worn jacket with a tone reserved for someone far above his own position, and Cole felt the heat rise behind his collar, not from the sun beating down on the tarmac but from the sudden, quiet realization that he had stepped into something he did not understand, his mind racing to reconcile what he had just witnessed with everything he had been trained to believe about order, authority, and rank, but nothing aligned, nothing fit, because Colonel Mercer was not issuing commands, not correcting the situation, he was waiting, standing just behind Arthur Hale with a stillness that mirrored the older man's own, as if the chain of command itself had shifted direction without explanation. And when Hale finally moved, it was not with urgency or display, just a slight bend as he reached down and picked up the worn leather pouch from the ground, brushing a thin layer of dust from its surface with a motion so familiar it felt practiced over decades, and for a fleeting second his fingers lingered on the cracked leather, and the world seemed to pull inward around that small gesture, the roar of the helicopter fading, the bright glare of the sun softening, replaced by something older, heavier, the memory of a different heat, a different sky, where the air carried the scent of oil and rain instead of jet fuel, where the same pouch had once been new, its stitching tight, its weight different, filled with tools that did not belong in any manual but had saved more lives than any system ever designed, and the echo of rotor blades had not been controlled or distant but urgent, uneven, cutting through chaos instead of routine, and then the moment passed, snapping back into the present with the sharp edge of reality, Hale straightening slowly, the pouch now resting securely in his hand, his gaze shifting just enough to meet Mercer's, and there was no need for explanation, no need for names or ranks to be spoken aloud, because whatever existed between them had been forged long before this flight line, long before Cole had ever worn a uniform, and Mercer gave the smallest nod, barely noticeable, but absolute in its meaning, and then he stepped half a pace back, making space without stepping away, a gesture so precise it carried intent without words, and Hale turned, not toward the helicopter, not toward the gathered personnel, but along the edge of the runway as if following a path only he could see, and Mercer followed, not beside him, not ahead, but just behind, matching his pace without question, and that was when the silence broke, not with sound but with understanding spreading through the people watching, technicians lowering their eyes, airmen straightening unconsciously, even the ones who did not know why, feeling the shift as something instinctive, something that demanded respect without asking for it, and Lieutenant Cole stood frozen where he was, the authority he had carried moments before now feeling thin, misplaced, because nothing in this scene responded to him anymore, nothing required his input or his permission, and as Hale continued forward with that same steady, unhurried stride, the entire flight line seemed to open around him, not by command, not by order, but by something far stronger, something earned in a time and place none of them had seen, and the only thing Cole could hear now was the fading echo of that single word, still resonating in his mind, reshaping everything he thought he knew about who truly held power in moments like this. No one gave the order to clear a path, but it happened anyway, subtle at first, a half step back from a crew chief, a quiet shift from an airman who suddenly found something else to look at, and then wider, smoother, like a current moving through the formation as Arthur Hale walked forward with that same measured pace, the worn leather pouch now resting at his side as if it belonged there more than anything else on that flight line. And Colonel Mercer remained just behind him, not guiding, not leading, simply following with a precision that was impossible to ignore, his posture unchanged, his attention fixed, and that was what unsettled everyone the most. Not the arrival, not the helicopter, but the fact that a man who commanded hundreds, who carried authority that shaped entire operations, had chosen position instead of control, had chosen silence instead of command. And Staff Sergeant Grant felt it settle deeper into his understanding with every step they took, the realization that whatever this was, it was not about rank in the way it was written on paper, it was about something older, something earned in places that did not appear in briefings or reports, and he glanced toward Lieutenant Cole, who had not moved, not followed, not spoken, his earlier certainty now replaced with a rigid stillness as he watched the scene unfold without him, his mind trying to catch up to something already far ahead, because nothing in his training had prepared him for a moment where authority did not assert itself, where it stepped aside instead, and the sound of the helicopter began to fade as its rotors slowed, the sharp chop of the blade softening into a steady hum that blended into the background, leaving behind a quieter space where every movement felt amplified, every step deliberate, and Hale did not rush, did not acknowledge the people parting around him, his gaze forward, steady, as if he had walked this path before in a different time, under different skies, and for a brief moment, as he adjusted his grip on the pouch, the memory returned, not as a flash, but as a presence, the weight of it pressing against the present, the feel of rough terrain under boots instead of smooth concrete, the distant echo of voices carried on wind instead of radio static, the sense of responsibility that did not come from orders but from the simple fact that others depended on you without question, and then it was gone again, replaced by the present, by the quiet rhythm of his steps, and Mercer matched them without hesitation, without deviation, as if there had never been another option, and the distance between them and the rest of the flight line grew, not physically at first, but in understanding, in the widening gap between what had just happened and what anyone could explain, and behind them the personnel remained where they were, no one daring to break the moment with unnecessary movement, because it felt wrong, felt out of place, like speaking in a room where something important was still unfolding, and Grant finally lowered his radio completely. His role finished for now, but his attention unwavering. Because he knew this was not over, not yet, not with the way Mercer had responded, not with the way Hale carried himself, and as the two figures continued toward the far edge of the runway where the heat shimmer blurred everything into a distant horizon, one question lingered unspoken among those left behind, not who the old man was, but what kind of history made a colonel follow without hesitation, and more importantly, what was about to happen next now that he had arrived. The heat at the far edge of the runway felt different, quieter, as if the noise of the base had chosen not to follow, and Arthur Hale slowed just enough for the distance between each step to stretch, not from fatigue but from intention, his eyes scanning the horizon where the concrete met the open expanse beyond, and Colonel Mercer adjusted his pace instantly, maintaining that same position just behind and to the side, never overtaking, never falling back, a shadow shaped by respect rather than obligation, and for several seconds neither man spoke, the silence between them carrying a weight that did not need to be filled, until Hale finally stopped, not abruptly, but with a subtle shift that signaled the end of movement, and Mercer stopped with him, boots settling into place with a quiet finality, the wind tugging lightly at their uniforms as the last echoes of the helicopter faded completely into the background, leaving only the distant hum of the base far behind them, and Hale looked out across the empty stretch ahead, his gaze narrowing slightly as if measuring something unseen, and when he spoke his voice was low, steady, unchanged from before. "You brought it back online," he said, not as a question, not as a guess, but as a statement, and Mercer answered without hesitation, his tone precise, controlled, but carrying something deeper beneath it. "Yes, sir, as soon as we confirmed the signal," and that word again, sir, not forced, not formal, but natural, as if it had always belonged there, and Hale gave a slight nod, his hand resting on the leather pouch, fingers pressing lightly against its worn surface, and for a brief moment the world seemed to shift again, the present bending just enough for something older to press through, the memory of a cold night where signals had meant survival, where silence had been louder than noise, where decisions had carried weight measured not in orders but in outcomes, and then it was gone, replaced by the present, by the steady wind and the open sky, and Hale turned just slightly, not fully facing Mercer, but enough for his voice to carry with quiet clarity. "You were not supposed to answer it this quickly," and Mercer's jaw tightened. Almost imperceptibly, not in defiance, not in disagreement, but in acknowledgement. "We monitor everything tied to that channel, sir, nothing like that gets ignored anymore," and there was something in the way he said it, something that hinted at lessons learned long after the events that had created them, and Hale studied him for a moment, his eyes calm but searching, as if weighing not the words but the meaning behind them, and then he looked back out toward the horizon again, the silence returning, heavier now, more deliberate, and behind them, far enough to remain unseen but close enough to feel the shift. Staff Sergeant Grant had moved just beyond the edge of the flight line, stopping at a distance that respected the moment while still keeping it within view, his instincts telling him this was not a conversation meant for interruption but one that mattered more than anything happening behind him. And back near the center of the tarmac, Lieutenant Cole remained where he had been left, watching from afar, the figures now smaller against the vast backdrop, but the weight of what he had witnessed pressing harder with every second, because he could no longer deny it, could no longer reduce it to something simple or procedural. And as the wind carried the faintest trace of their voices back across the distance, he realized that whatever this was, whatever history connected those two men, it had just stepped back into the present, and the base itself had shifted to accommodate it, whether anyone understood it or not. The wind shifted slightly, carrying a faint trace of jet fuel across the open edge of the runway, but neither man reacted to it, because whatever mattered here was no longer tied to the base behind them, and Arthur Hale let the silence stretch just a few seconds longer before he spoke again, his voice quieter now, not weaker, just more deliberate. They kept the frequency alive, and it was not a question, not even an observation. It was something closer to confirmation, like a piece of a larger picture settling into place, and Colonel Mercer gave a small nod, his eyes fixed forward, not daring to interrupt the rhythm of the moment. "Yes, sir. After what happened, they made sure it would never go dark again," and the way he said it carried something unspoken, something that did not need details to be understood, and Hale's fingers tightened slightly around the leather pouch, the worn edges pressing into his palm as if grounding him in the present while something else pressed forward from the past, a memory not of chaos but of consequence, of a moment where a signal had been missed, where silence had not been chosen but forced, and the cost of that absence had shaped everything that followed, and for a brief second his posture changed, not visibly to most, but enough that Mercer saw it, enough that he recognized the weight behind it, and he spoke carefully, choosing his words with precision. "We corrected it, sir. Protocols were rewritten, redundancies built, nothing gets overlooked anymore," and there was a quiet certainty in his tone, not defensive, not proud, just factual, and Hale turned his head slightly, his gaze settling on Mercer with a calm that carried more authority than any rank insignia ever could. "Systems fail," he said simply, and the words were not criticism, not accusation, just truth, and Mercer held that gaze for a fraction longer than before answering. "People do too, sir, but we do not let it happen twice," and the statement hung between them, steady, unshaken, and Hale studied him for a moment, as if measuring not the words but the man who spoke them, and then he gave the slightest nod, the kind that did not acknowledge rank but understanding, and the tension in the air shifted again, not disappearing, but changing shape, becoming something quieter, more settled, as if a line had been drawn and accepted without further need for explanation. And behind them, at a distance that felt both far and close at the same time, Staff Sergeant Grant remained still, his position unchanged, his attention unwavering, because he could feel it, that this was not just a conversation, it was a reckoning of something older than any of them, something that had shaped the very structure they stood within, and even from where he stood he could sense the difference now, the way Colonel Mercer carried himself. Not as a commanding officer in that moment, but as someone standing in the presence of a history he respected more than his own authority, and back on the flight line Lieutenant Cole had finally taken a step forward, then stopped again, uncertainty holding him in place, because the closer he tried to get to understanding what was happening, the further it seemed to move beyond his reach, and the figures at the edge of the runway remained the center of it all, still, grounded, unaffected by the distance or the eyes watching them, and as the wind picked up slightly, tugging at Hale's jacket once more, he shifted his stance just enough to face forward again, his voice returning to that same quiet certainty as before. "Show me," he said, and this time there was no ambiguity in the command, no room for interpretation, and Mercer did not hesitate, not even for a second, because whatever was about to happen next had already been set in motion long before this moment, long before this base, and the weight of it was finally about to surface. Colonel Mercer did not ask questions, did not clarify, he simply turned the moment the words left Arthur Hale's mouth, already moving with a precision that made it clear this path had been prepared long before today, and Hale followed without hesitation, his steps measured, unhurried, yet carrying a direction that did not need to be explained, and together they moved toward a section of the base most personnel rarely noticed, a reinforced structure set just beyond the visible edge of the runway, where the concrete shifted tone and the air felt cooler, controlled, as if the space itself operated under a different set of rules, and Mercer reached the secured access panel first, his hand moving to the scanner without breaking stride, the system responding instantly with a soft confirmation tone as the door released with a muted hydraulic sound, and he stepped aside, not out of duty but out of respect, allowing Hale to enter first. And for a brief second Hale paused at the threshold, his eye scanning the interior not with curiosity but with recognition, as if the space aligned with something already known, and then he stepped inside, Mercer following just behind, the door sealing quietly behind them, cutting off the outside world completely, and inside the room the air was cooler, the hum of advanced systems replacing the noise of engines and wind, large displays lining the walls, data streams moving in steady patterns, but Hale did not look at any of it, his focus drawn instead to a single console at the center, its interface active, waiting, and Mercer moved to it immediately, his movements efficient, practiced, as he initiated a sequence that brought the system fully online, the screen shifting, consolidating, forming a single focus display that pulsed softly with a signal that seemed almost alive, and for the first time since arriving, Hale stepped closer, his gaze narrowing slightly as he studied the pattern, the rhythm of it, the way it held steady against the background noise, and his hand moved slowly to the leather pouch, opening it with a familiar motion, revealing a small, worn device inside, its surface aged but intact, its purpose not immediately clear to anyone unfamiliar with it, and Mercer stepped back half a pace, giving space without being told. His attention fixed, because he understood the significance even if he had never seen this exact moment play out, and Hale lifted the device carefully, holding it up to the console, aligning it with the signal on the display, and for a brief moment nothing happened, just silence, just the steady hum of the room, and then the system responded, the signal sharpening, stabilizing, the pattern locking into place with a clarity that had not been there before, and Mercer felt it immediately. That shift, that confirmation, something that had been theoretical now becoming real, tangible, and Hale lowered the device slightly, his expression unchanged, but his eyes carrying the weight of recognition, and he spoke quietly, more to the room than to Mercer. "It is still there," and Mercer nodded once, his voice equally controlled. "Yes, sir, we have been tracking it for years, but we could never fully align it," and Hale glanced at him briefly, the smallest hint of understanding passing between them. "You needed the original," he said, and Mercer did not respond immediately, because the truth of that statement settled deeper than any protocol or system could account for, and as the signal on the screen pulsed steadily, stronger now, clearer than it had ever been, one thing became undeniable: whatever had been started long ago had not ended, it had only been waiting, and now, for the first time in decades, it had been fully brought back into the light. The signal held steady on the screen, no longer flickering, no longer uncertain, a clean and constant pulse that filled the room with a quiet authority of its own, and for several seconds neither man spoke, because there was nothing left to confirm, nothing left to question, only the weight of what it meant settling into the space between them, and Arthur Hale lowered the device slowly, his fingers resting against its worn edges as if feeling something far beyond the metal itself, something carried through years, through silence, through moments that had never been written down, and he closed the leather pouch with a soft click, the sound small but final, and Colonel Mercer watched without interruption, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, because he understood now that this was not about systems or protocols, not about data or signals, it was about continuity, about something that had endured long after the people who created it had stepped away, and Hale turned slightly, his gaze moving once more to the display, the steady rhythm of the signal reflecting faintly in his eyes, and when he spoke his voice was quieter than before, not weaker, but resolved. "It was never meant to be found this way," and Mercer drew a slow breath, the meaning of those words settling deeper than any report he had ever read. "We thought it was lost, sir," he said, not as an excuse, but as a statement of what they had believed for years. And Hale gave a faint nod, acknowledging the truth of that without accepting its conclusion. "It was not lost," he replied, his tone calm, unwavering. "It was waiting, and the distinction changed everything, not just the past, but the present, because waiting implied purpose, implied intent that extended beyond time, and Mercer felt that realization take hold, shifting his understanding of everything they had built around this signal, everything they had assumed about its origin. And for the first time since entering the room, he allowed himself a question, carefully measured. "What do we do now, sir?" And Hale did not answer immediately, his eyes still on the display, still tracking the rhythm as if listening to something deeper than what it showed, and then he reached out, not to the console, not to the system, but to a single control that had remained untouched until now, his hand steady, deliberate, and when he pressed it the signal changed, not louder, not brighter, but clearer, as if a layer of distance had been removed, revealing something beneath it that had always been there, and the room seemed to hold its breath again, the systems adjusting around that change without resistance, without delay, and Hale stepped back, his decision made, his role in this moment complete, and he turned toward the exit without looking back, as if what needed to be done had already been set in motion beyond his presence, and Mercer followed immediately, not out of habit, not out of rank, but because he understood that whatever came next would not wait, would not slow down, and as the door opened and the sound of the outside world returned, the steady pulse of the signal remained behind them, continuing without interruption, stronger now, undeniable, and back on the flight line the silence that had settled earlier still lingered, the personnel waiting without knowing why, until the door finally opened and the two figures stepped back into the light, and this time no one